And today we're here to welcome Edward Focke Breen, and I will tell you this is a real treat. We have been over the last probably 8 months corresponding back and forth, and every time I get an email from him, I learn so much more, and it's just so much fun to talk to him. So Mr. Breen is coming as he shares stories from his book, and if you've not seen his book, I have a copy that's mine, but he's also offered to sell his copy if you're interested, because it is out of print. The book is Lucky Eddie, Lifetimes in the Family of Dayton U.S. Congressman Edward G. Breen, Ed's father. It is well written, it's fun to read, so if you can grab a copy, do it. All right, Mr. Breen's going to talk us through the very interesting life of his father, former Dayton Mayor and U.S. Congressman Edward Grimes Breen. The stories Ed's going to share are as relevant today as they were when they happened during his father's tenure in Congress and mayor of Dayton. So just say, hang on. So I could spend minutes talking about this topic. It's better to let Mr. Breen tell the story the way only he can do. As I've learned from his emails, be prepared to be captivated by an interesting and full life of Edward Grimes Breen that he led and what a significant part of Dayton, the region, the nation, and Oakwood's history of the Breen family has played for us. Edward Breen, just a little brief bio, is an Ohio native. He is a school teacher who has spent a lifetime traveling Europe, North Africa, and the Americas. A graduate of Capital University who has done which is also my dad's alma mater, by the way, who has done postgraduate work at Antioch University. He's married to Catherine Taylor, a writer and former magazine editor, and they and their 2 sons, they're not there now, but the sons grew up in Kettering, Ohio, and they spend their summers at their home in Maine. So, with that said, I give you Edward Breen.
Hi, I'm Ed Breen, son of Lucky Eddie. If you were to bring him back to life today, he wouldn't know his name is Lucky Eddie because that was never anything he was ever called in life. When I wrote this book, my wife titled it Lucky Eddie, and it just sort of took on a life of its own. My father married late in life. He was 48 years old when he married, and his father was 48 when he had him, so there's a 98-year difference between my grandfather and I. And my grandfather had memories of being 5 years old and going to Columbus, Ohio with his father and seeing the body of Abraham Lincoln at the Capitol. And people said, no, that must be your great-grandfather. I said, no, it was my grandfather. And my father was about 70 years old when I was in college, and he would go down to Neil's Heritage House, a restaurant that used to be in this town, and he was bored, and I'd join him there for lunch, and he would tell me these stories. And occasionally he would go down to a place called Flying Pizza, which is still here in Dayton. And he liked Flying Pizza because Joe, the owner, was a very big talker. And the pizza's good at Flying Pizza. But the thing that was most important to him at Flying Pizza was they had great big picture windows, and it was right across the street from the Dayton Biltmore. So he would sit there and eat a pizza and look out the Dayton Biltmore and tell me, I remember that when somebody was on this sidewalk here. I remember that. And it was more of a remembrance place than the actual pizza. He was not a pizza connoisseur. That was kind of new to his taste palates, I would say. So anyways, these are the stories that he told me. And my father was born June 10th, 1908. In the Phillips House Hotel, this is the Phillips House. And to give you some reference points, the courthouse is over here across the street. There's a building next door right here, and then the Dayton Arcade is next door to that. And it's right on the corner of 3rd and Main. It was built in 1852, and Abraham Lincoln stayed there in 1859 with his wife Mary and gave a speech on the courthouse steps. My father was born in basically the bed that Abraham Lincoln used when he napped that afternoon. And we still currently have the bed in the family. It's more important to me that he was born in it rather than Abraham Lincoln slept in it. So, his father, John P., was the manager and had been the manager of the Phillips House since 1894. And John came from a background where his mother and father were Irish immigrants. They couldn't speak really good English, and they couldn't read or write, and his mother died when he was 10, And he was raised by his father, and his father was a dray driver for the railroads. And occasionally in the 1850s, he would go down to Cincinnati and find runaway slaves and hide them under the train, steal train parts, and move them up to Yellow Springs and get them on a night train. And that was the background that John came from. And then he married a very wealthy woman from Cleveland, Ohio, who was from a German family, and she taught all of her children to speak German, and without the trace of an American accent. And her father came to America with no money, Henry Beckman. He invented the process of mass producing clothes on an assembly line, and he was to the clothing industry what Henry Ford was to the auto industry. And so John Breen came from this shacky little house on the railroad tracks up to Cleveland, Ohio, and a maid opened the door, and it was so far beyond what he was capable of doing. And on the first date, he asked her to marry him, and he said, well, the horse, when I put it away that night, after asking my wife to marry, my fiance to marry me, the horse dropped over dead, and he said, I think it went into shock when I heard my marriage proposal. And so my father had an older sister, Mary Louise. Mary Louise, as she wrote about one of her aunts, was a tough old bird. And Mary Louise basically watched my father from cradle to grave. There was not a time in my father's life where Mary Louise didn't watch over his life. And she would today deny that, and he would probably deny that, but truth is, the truth is. And they had an older brother, John, who's 8 years older than them, and Mary Louise and Ed were not real close to John because he was so much older. And then they had an older brother, Henry, that none of them knew because Henry died at age 1 in a horse and carriage accident when the horse ran away. It got spooked and the carriage flipped over and the 1-year-old child was killed. And so John managed the Phillips house, and through the Phillips house, Governor Cox, who was governor of Ohio at that time, and the governor had a permanent room at the Phillips house. He had late night meetings at the if he had late night meetings at the newspaper office, he'd come over to the Phillips house and not wake his family up at 1 in the morning, and he'd spend the night. And when my father was 3 and 4 years old, he would then say to my father, come on over here and play checkers with me. So my father would come over and play checkers with him. Orville and Wilbur Wright used to eat dinner there a lot with their father, Reverend Milton Wright. And my father got to know them, and Orville taught my father how to make a paper airplane. And my father remained friends with Orville the rest of his life, as well as the governor. And in 1926, they tore down the Phillips house, and John Breen went into retirement. And they opened up a new hotel. Well, if you change the picture, this is a picture of my father on vacation and riding on an ostrich. And it's just out in Los Angeles. And he said it was actually a very dangerous thing to do because they pulled the blinders off, and a man, you can kind of see his picture there, would jump out and grab him and pull him off the ostrich before it ran away. And so then, if you go to the next picture, is the Dayton Biltmore, and it opened in 1929, 1 week after the stock market crash. And the first year it was open, they had 17 suicides at the Dayton Biltmore. And it got so bad, clerks would say to somebody, I wonder if this guy's coming over to register for a room for jumping or a room for sleeping. And it was kind of a macabre sort of humor. And they went bankrupt within about a month. And they called John Breen and said, would you take over the Biltmore and manage the Biltmore? And my grandfather said, yes, I will. But he said, I have one stipulation, that you allow my son, Eddie, to be co-manager with me. So they brought my father in, and he was co-manager with his father. And this was 1929. And soon after they started getting started, John, my grandfather, hired a man by the name of Henry Parks to be the bartender. Henry Parks was the best bartender in the city of Dayton, bar none. And after about a month of Henry being there, 4 waiters came up to my grandfather's office and said, we can't work with Henry down there, he's driving away business, and we're gonna quit on you if you don't get rid of Henry. And my grandfather said, well, what's the problem? And they said, well, nobody wants to be served a drink by a black man when there's so many white people selling apples on the street corner. And my father said, well, then send Henry up to my office and I'll solve your problem for you. And so Henry comes up to my grandfather's office, and my grandfather said, how many drinks a minute can you make, Henry? And he said, as many as you want, Mr. Breen. He said, how many varieties of drinks can you make, Mr. Breen? And he said, as many as you want. And my grandfather said, are you aware of the fact that 4 men just came up here and told me they can't work with you down there in the dining room? And he said, yes. He said, I was aware of that. And at that time period, if you lost your job, you were never gonna find another job. So John said, that makes me so damn mad. He said, I'm promoting you, Henry, to head of the dining room, and I'm giving you a substantial pay raise. And he said, please go downstairs and tell those 4 men that we don't need them at the hotel anymore. They can come back on Friday and pick up their paycheck. Well, it got around town, and they started getting hate mail from the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan said, we're gonna pick at the hotel and this and that. And the owners of the hotel, which was Winter's Bank at that point, called my father over and my grandfather and said, you're gonna have to change your mind. The Klan's gonna pick at the hotel. And John Breen sat there in his chair and said, I took over this hotel 4 months ago. I'm turning a profit for you. Don't you dare come over and tell me how to run my hotel. I won't come over and tell you how to run your bank. And if you're gonna tell me how to run the hotel, I'll quit on you. And so they backed off. And along the same lines, a very famous trumpet player wanted to play at Victory Theater, and his advance man called my father and said, can this man stay at the hotel? And my father called the owners and they said, well, let's think about it. And about 4 days later, they called my father back and said, yeah, he can stay here, but he has to use the freight elevator, put him up on the top floor, and he can't use the dining room. And John Breen about had a gasket, and John said, I've never told anyone in my life they can't use my dining room. And so John went up to the 16th floor, took a conference room, turned it into the dining room. They hired a band, they brought in flowers, and then they went to the man and said, after you play at Victory Theater, come back, there's a party going on the 16th floor and everybody wants to meet you and get your autograph. And then they did the same thing in the morning for breakfast. So they basically brought the dining room to the man. And my father lived under a very strict contract. He had to have his hair coiffured every morning. He had to have his nails buffed, and he had to wear white gloves to open your car door. And the Dayton Biltmore at that time period was bragging on the fact that they were a fireproof hotel because it was all brick. They had a dining room called the Kitty Hawk Room, and they had the largest, if you turn the picture to the next one, you'll see the Kitty Hawk Room. This is the Kitty Hawk dining room. They had the largest mirrored ceiling in America, according to the man that put the mirrored ceiling there. They had an orchestra pit that would hold 16-piece orchestra, and 75 couples could dance on the dance floor. And you put your shoes outside the door at night, and a man came by and polished your shoes, and then you also left your money in an ashtray, and another man came by, polished your nickels, dimes, and quarters, and pressed your dollar bills. And a room was $1 or $2, and a suite of rooms was $4. And you could get a Thanksgiving dinner for about $1 for the entire Thanksgiving dinner. And they had a parking garage under the building that held 200 cars. And one of the weirder stories that my father told was a couple came in around 1933, and this couple, it was Halloween night, and they had dinner in the dining room, and then they went off and went to bed. And about 1 in the morning, my father received a phone call that they need a doctor to this room. There's been an emergency. So he said, I went up to the room before I called the house doctor to find out what this emergency was about. And the woman had taken her clothes off when her husband fell asleep, walked out in the hallway nude, put on a Halloween mask, and then she knocked on the door, and he didn't open it right away, so she knocked again, and he opened the door, and she's standing there nude with a Halloween mask on, and she said, trick or treat, and he was so shocked, he fell backwards and hit his head on the door frame, and had to get stitches in his head. And
great story.
Another time, John Breidenball came in, who's head of the unions, and he was very drunk, and a friend of his said, John, why do you carry that pistol with you? And he said, you couldn't hit the broadside of a barn. And they were in the bar, and he picked out that pistol and bam, shot a light out. See that light over there? Bam, shot that light out. And the bartender went screaming up to my father's office and said, John Breidenball's in here, he's head of the AFL-CIO union, and he's shooting out the lights. And so my father went out and grabbed him, took him to an alley and called a cab, and they stuck him in a cab and said, make sure this man gets home. And then my father went back, and a policeman came in and says, is there a shooting here? And my father said, no, some man ran off the street, shot some lights out, and ran back out of the building, and I don't know who he was. And they didn't reveal who he was. And Paul Mance used to come there, and he was the #1 stunt pilot, if you turn the picture. Well, first off, Ray Bolger used to come there a lot. That's Ray Bolger with who was the Scarecrow in The Wizard of Oz. And he and my father became very good friends, and he would bounce around the room and practice for hours every afternoon. And then one day, John Dillinger came, and Dillinger came into the hotel and said he was a salesman from Indiana, and the clerk called my father over and said, this man says he's a salesman from Indiana, but I don't recognize him. And my father said, I talked to him for a few minutes, and he said he seemed okay, so I said, oh, go ahead and cash the check. Well, the next day, he got a call from the Dayton Police Department saying that they had arrested John Dillinger, and would you come down and identify him? And so I came down to the police station and identified him as the man that was in the hotel that day. And the next day, they sent him to Lima, Ohio, and his gang broke into the jail there and killed the sheriff, and he became public enemy number one after that. And Paul Mance used to stay there at the hotel. The next picture is Paul Mance, and that's Amelia Earhart. The picture's not rare. The picture was taken at the 1934 Bendix races. But what's rare is the autographs on there. Terry Minor was the widow of Roger Minor, a pilot who had died, and she came to Dayton and started dating my father. And she wanted to marry my father, and he didn't want to marry Terry, so she fell in love with Paul Mance and eventually married Paul Mance. Amelia Earhart really disliked Terry, and Paul said to and Paul is the only pilot in America ever licensed to fly a plane under a bridge, through a building, or between trees. Any movie that you've ever seen since 1934 to 65 when he died, making a movie, he was the one that did the flying. And some people didn't like him in Hollywood because they said he was like to hold it over you on the lot because he's the only number in the phone book. You couldn't call somebody else and say, would you bring your plane and fly under a bridge? It was only Paul Mance licensed to do that. And so if you go to the next photo, this is a Northrop A-17. My father's there, his mother, and his younger nephew. And that nephew died last year, his 91-year-old man. And there's a big gas truck, and his mother turned to him and said, Eddie, Paul Mance is so nice to fly you to California, you offer to pay for the gas. My father said, I took one look at that truck, and I said, I wasn't about to pay for the gas. And to my father, we just flew in a two-seater airplane. He didn't know it was a Northrop A-17. And he said, we were flying over the Grand Canyon, and Paul radioed me in the back and said, have you ever seen the Grand Canyon before? And my father said, no, I never have. And he said, I thought he was gonna tip the wings, let me look over the side. Instead, he nosedived that plane straight to the Grand Canyon, shot it up another wall, and then flew upside down through the Grand Canyon. And my father said, I thought my heart was gonna pound out my stomach. He said, it scared the daylights out of me. And Wright Field said, if you're making the claim that Paul Mance dove a Northrop A-17, yes, the Northrop A-17 could have done that, and yes, Paul Mance at the controls is probably the only pilot in America that could have done something like that. And so they said, we believe that story. And they go out to California, and my father said it was a very uncomfortable evening. They stayed at the Biltmore Hotel in Los Angeles, and Amelia was not talking to Terry. Her husband, George Putnam, was talking to Paul, and Paul said, you need to put a radio on that plane with a drag antenna so she can get 2 miles extra talk. And George Putnam was like, you blank, Paul Mance, we're not waiting around for that, put it on there. And my father said, I remember that conversation years later. And my father said, I basically talked to Terry, and I talked to Amelia a little bit, but it was stinted conversations because they didn't like everybody. And Wright Field said, how did you get Amelia to sign a photograph with Paul in there? And I said, well, they signed the photograph first, and after dessert, they left. And then Paul and Terry signed the picture. And Paul was killed in 1965 making a movie called Raising of the Phoenix. He was asked towards nightfall to make another circle round, and he crashed into a mountainside and was killed and died instantly. And in the 1930s, Alice Roosevelt used to come to the Biltmore, and Alice Roosevelt was the oldest daughter of Theodore Roosevelt. My father absolutely couldn't stand the woman. He thought she was a jerk, and his sister always said, your dad's a stick in the mud, he needs to get a sense of humor. And I told that to my father, and he said, what's so funny about going down a hallway at a 45-year-old woman, and she mixes up everybody's shoes and ties them in knots? And she said, all she did was inconvenience people. And he said, this woman's 45 years old. She's married to the Speaker of the House. And he said, one day a man came in my office and was ranting and raving because she threw a water balloon out the window and soaked this man. And he wanted me to pay for the dry cleaning bill for his suit. And Alice was born in the 1880s, and when she was born, her mother died 2 hours after she was born. The grandmother, Theodore Roosevelt's mother, died an hour later up on the second floor. And Theodore left, went out west and gave his daughter to his sister, and she was raised by her aunt for the first 3 years of her life. And when he became president, Alice would stand in line behind the tourists going through the White House, and she would throw a mouse on the ground and go, a mouse, there's a mouse, and get everybody to start screaming and running. And she just sort of remained a wild child, and somebody said to her father, you know, you need to control your daughter. And he goes, I can either run the country or control my daughter, but I can't do both. And years later, when she was in her 90s, Richard Nixon came to her home and said, Alice, and she said, Mr. Nixon, disregarding the fact that he was president of the United States, she said, my garbage man calls me Alice, my maid calls me Alice, but you, sir, can refer to me as Mrs. Longworth. And she carried a pillow with her in her old age, and when she had parties, and the pillow said, if you can't find anything nice to say about somebody, then come sit next to me. And my father said, every time she came to the hotel, there was an incident, something happened. And one time they had some Shriners there at the hotel, and there was a parade down below of Shriners, and these Shriners were up, half of them were up in the balcony on the outside patio on the 16th floor, and they took a bag of water, said, we'll drop it on somebody watching the parade and soak that person. Well, that bag of water came down and hit this man on the head and killed him. And my father said, I had to call his wife and say that your husband was killed by a guest at our hotel, and I had to go to the hospital in the ambulance with that man. And the one thing that haunted my father, probably the rest of his life, and he never got over it. He said, I was 26 years old, 27 years old. I was working with my father, and a guy came up to me and said, can I talk to you for a few minutes? And he said, I'm real busy right now. I said, come back in about 2 hours. And he said, I walked out of the hotel about 20 minutes later, and a man jumped out of the top floor. And he said, his body came down so close to me, and his head went out into the street. And he said, I had to go out in the street and get his head. And every time he told me that story, I said, that's the grossest thing I ever heard. And he said, well, you don't know how you're going to respond when something like that happens. And he said, if I didn't take his head out of the street, some car might have hit it, or some ambulance driver, or somebody's going to have to go out in the street and do it. And then he said, I went in the dining room, pulled a tablecloth off the table, and covered his body. But he said, I always regret the rest of my life that I didn't take 5 minutes to talk to that man. And he said, I don't know why I thought it was so important, but he said, if I'd taken 5 minutes to talk to that man, maybe that wouldn't have happened. And in 1935, his sister was recruited by Jim Cox, the former governor, now owner of the newspaper, and they asked her to go to Germany and spy on Adolf Hitler. And so his sister was 32 years old. She was assigned to the American Embassy, Berlin, and she went to the American Embassy, and she would spy on Hitler, but never took notes. And then she'd come back occasionally, about every 6 months, and she was dating Jim Cox Jr., and the two of them would go out on a date, and then she'd come back to the Cox home. And Jim Cox had run for president in 1920, and his vice president was Franklin Roosevelt, now the president. She would have dinner with the Cox family and then go into the library with the governor and tell her everything she saw in Germany. And she was doing that until 1939, and in 39, she wrote to my father and said, get out of the National Guard. She said, this is for real, and this man's going to set the world on fire. And he wrote the War Department, and he wrote him back and said, unfortunately, we're not going to release you from command. And so when Pearl Harbor hit, when Hitler attacked Poland, she fled to Norway, and then she was sent to Madrid, Spain, to the embassy there, where she dressed as a Catholic nun, and she was going into occupied France, pulling out American pilots that had been shot down, and smuggling Jewish families out. And she would broadcast German troop movements to American forces in Europe. And she was kind of a 6'2" woman, and it upset my father that she was a colonel and he was only a captain. He said it took me 15 years to become a captain. And he said she joins up and she's a colonel right away. And he said, I didn't like the fact that my sister outranked me. And when Pearl Harbor hit, he called his mother and said, I'm being sent to my duty station. So he went to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and they said, your unit pulled out. about 2 hours ago. So he got some motorcycle police and they caught up with his unit and they went down to Fort Bliss, Texas, because they didn't know if America was going to be invaded by Mexico. And while they were along the Texas-Mexican border, he saw a newspaper headline that said, "Texas declares war on Germany and Japan." And it was a big, huge headline. And below it, it said, "And so does the United States." In very much smaller print. And they started dating some of the girls in the area. And my father said after the first date, "You know, that girl I went out with last night had a wooden arm." And they said, "That's baloney. She did not have a wooden arm." And he said, "Yes, she did." And they said, "I'll bet you $10 because we were out with you and we didn't see a wooden arm." So the next night they go out with these same girls. And the guy said to my father, "Here's $10, Ed. I guess I owe you $10. The other guy said, "Yeah, Ed, here's $10. And a month later, they get sent to Wisconsin for machine gun training. And then they're put on trains and sent to Fort Dix, New Jersey. And the windows of the train had been painted over. And he said, even if you took a nickel and scratched off the window, the Corps of Army Engineers had changed all the billboard signs along the train track. So it said, 'Welcome to First National Bank of Frankfort, Kentucky,' when you might be in Topeka, Kansas." And they were offered heavy equipment. They were given Arctic warfare equipment, heavy boots. And the Army intelligence was mixed in with his troops. And they said, "You're being sent to the Russian front to help the Russians fight the Germans." And they were then loaded onto troop trains and sent to Fort Dix. And then they were loaded onto ships where they had to stay below deck for 5 days. And after 5 days, they were brought up. And my father said, "You took one look out there." And he said, "You saw every kind of ship. There were over 600 ships in the convoy." And General Patton said, "Tomorrow morning, we've been zigzagging off the coast of Africa. We're going to land, and it's going to be a three-pronged invasion. And we're going to land at Oran, Algiers, and Casablanca." And so my father landed at Casablanca, and just before the landing, an officer stood up and said, "Is there any questions about what General Patton just said?" And the guy said, "Yeah." He said, "The fighting tomorrow's going to be intense." He said, "What kind of tents? Pup tents, dome tents?" And then the question was, "Shut up, Ferguson. We don't need that stuff from you." And so the next day, the landings weren't half as bad, but they loaded the troops onto troop trains, and they were sending these troops out into the desert to go farther, but the Arabs were riding alongside the troop trains and shooting into the troop trains. So they asked my father to go out and meet with the Arab chieftains, the Triggs, and tell them to quit shooting into the troop trains. So he and 4 other men went out into the desert, and you'll see a picture of, you'll have to turn, yeah, these are what it looked like. And my father came to really dislike camels. He couldn't stand camels. He said they're mean, they're ugly, they spit. And for the rest of his life, he never liked camels. But he went out, and the Triggs were known as the blue men of the Sahara because of a blue dye they used in their clothes. And he sat on these carpets and they gave him a lamb's eye, and he said, "I was no more going to eat that lamb's eye." And he said, "I hid it under the carpet when they weren't watching." And their wives and daughters came out and did a belly dance. And if you go to the next picture, they gave him this Trig cross. And a Trig cross is 4 points of the world. And an Arab man would give that to his child at 7, 8 years old, a male child, and say, "I can't be with you everywhere you go in the world, but if you keep this for good luck, I will always be with you and God will be with you." And if you can read the writing on that Trig cross, it tells you what marketplace the family did their marketing. So if they find your body out in the desert, they would know where to return it to. And after North Africa, and my father said I could have gone home, but he said I was a single man, I didn't want somebody to replace me. And when you met a person in the military of his time period, everybody lied about who they were. He said, "Nobody told you the truth." And he said, one guy said, "I'm a weasel farmer from Des Moines, Iowa." Another guy said, "I'm from Baraboo, Wisconsin, and I'm in the circus." And some other man kind of rudely said, "So does that make you the head clown or something?" And one guy, my father always said, "I'm a goat farmer from Troy, Ohio," and he showed pictures of some old lady feeding goats, and he said, "This is my mom feeding the goats," and it was not his mom, and this and that. And one guy always said, "My sister Alice," and he would show pictures of his sister, and people would write to this woman, and she'd write back saying, "Thanks for looking out after Albert." And this and that. And my father said some of them started writing love letters to this woman, and she'd write love letters back. And they started writing torrid love letters to her. And he said we'd be out on night patrol sitting out in the desert, and somebody would say, what's Alice doing back in the States tonight? And he said we'd talk for hours about Alice. Well, after the war, Albert went into the construction business, and he built homes, and the first street he built, he called it Edward Breen Boulevard, and he demanded that my father come to Champaign, Illinois, and see, he said, we're having a parade in your honor, and the mayor's gonna be there, and my father really didn't wanna go, but he said, Albert was so insistent, he said, I go to Champaign, Illinois, and I had to stay at their apartment, and he said, the mother was like, this is my son Dick's bedroom, this is Albert's bedroom, this is our guest bedroom, this is my bedroom, this is the guest bedroom you're staying in. And he said, this is our living room, our dining room. And my father said, where's Alice stay? And she goes, Alice who? And he goes, well, your daughter. And she goes, I don't have a daughter named Alice, why would you think that? And my father said, well, all through the war, Albert said he had a sister named Alice. And she said, she grabbed him by the neck and started shaking him and said, Albert, you son of a bitch, why'd you lie to this nice man? And my father said, he just said, well, everybody lied to me, so I just lied back to him. And Albert never said in his lifetime who this woman was. And the biggest invasion and the hardest invasion for my father was the invasion of Italy. And they came with 500 British and American ships. And at 4 in the morning, the American ships started opening up fire on the harbor. And I'm gonna read this because this is how they loaded the landing boats. And this was at Salerno Bay, Italy. And he said, prior to invasions, the troops would climb over the side of a large Navy ship via a cargo net into the much smaller personal landing craft, vehicle craft personnel. This already dangerous climb, particularly in the rough seas, was made more difficult by the large backpacks, rifles, and the soldiers carried. Each boat carried 32 men, all loaded the same way. And they would circle in the Bay of Salerno for an hour while they're waiting for all the boats to get loaded. And the 3 men carrying the dynamite were always put in the rear of the boats. And in front of them would be 2 medics and a member of the clergy if one was available. Next, there would be 3 men carrying flamethrowers, and in front of them would be 2 mortar teams, and 3 men each, and 2 men with bazookas and 2 men to carry the bazooka shells. Then came 2 teams of riflemen. In front of them would be 3 soldiers called BAR men because they carried a hip-firing Browning automatic rifle that fired a 30 caliber slug at 650 rounds a minute. This is always where my father was in the boat. And then they had 4 men in front of them with heavy wire cutters. Finally, in the bow of the boat, they had a junior grade officer with a Colt 45. Each man carried 5 grenades, 4 smoke grenades, and each man carried 900, that BAR man carried 900 rounds of extra ammunition. The men in the back of the boat with the dynamite were always from Kentucky, Tennessee, and Pennsylvania because they were the children of coal miners. And they knew the properties of dynamite and where to place that dynamite to collapse those bunkers on the beachheads. And my father and Albert, his friend, told me later, he said the coxswain's mate would call out, we're in the mile zone. And when they called out, we're in the mile zone, he said we're within like a mile of the beach. And mortar rounds started coming in, the pinging of machine gun shells on the side of the boat. And my father said at that point, I pull out the trig cross I had on my dog tags and kiss the trig cross for good luck. And he said, at that point, your father would then call out, tap the horse. And he said, when your father called tap the horse, he said that was the scariest thing that could happen because the man in the front of the boat was from Syracuse, New York, and they called him the horse. And the 2 men in the back would tap the 2 in front of them, who would tap the 2 in front of them all the way up to the front of the boat. And it was their silent way of saying, goodbye, good luck, I've got your back. And he said, when you got on the beach, all hell broke loose. And they were in southern Italy, and my father said, I was then ordered to take the city of Naples. And I said, why would you be ordered to take the city of Naples when you were just a captain? And he said, well, I don't want to defame anybody, but he said, we knew that Naples had beriberi, cholera, dysentery. There were 10-year-old sniper kids up on the rooftop. And he said, your life expectancy was less than 50% going into Naples. And the men that went with him had special inoculations. And so he was ordered into the city of Naples, excuse me. And he was coming up the coast road, and he told all his tank drivers, truck drivers, and they were bringing in a huge convoy because they had to get a city twice the size of Dayton up and running. They had destroyed the fresh water system. They had pictures of nude women on the wall, and if you went and pulled that picture off the wall, it'd blow your hands off. They had put gasoline in light bulbs, so when you turned a light on in a room, the room blew up in a ball of flames. And my father said it was a very dangerous city to go to. And as they were coming up the coast road, he said to me, the real heroes were the men who were building the bridges overnight to support the weight of my tanks. And if you look at the next picture, this was a Baron Ricolardi, and he said, as we got to the top of the coast road, he said there were two bums standing by the side of the road, and he said they were flagging me down, and he said I couldn't understand why they wanted to talk to me so bad. So he said, I did what I told my men not to do. He said, I stopped an American tank column and sent my aide over, and he came back and said, this is Baron Ricolardi, and what he wrote was, the war has brought me many terrible things, but the one good thing it brought me is your friendship. And my father remained friends with the Baron for a very long time. And if you go to the next picture, that's King Victor Emmanuel. The other man he thought was a bum was King Victor Emmanuel. And they said to my father, if you give us 2 truckloads of food because our family's starving to death, we'll get you to the center of Naples. And so my father said, you can have your 2 truckloads of food, just get me to the center of Naples. And he said at that point it sort of became kind of comical that this old beat-up limo was leading an American tank column into Naples. And my father took over the head post office, and Time and Life magazine were embedded with his troops, and they took over the building next door. And he said, I took over the post office because it was the highest building in the area, and the harbor was totally destroyed. And the next day we drew straws to see who was gonna walk about a mile to get the food for lunch. And he said, I walked with 4 other officers to get lunch for everybody we left behind in the building. And there was dynamite behind his office wall. And he said, we were coming back with everybody's lunch, and that dynamite went off and killed everybody in the building. The building collapsed, and over 100 people died in the building that day. And as he settled into Naples, a Army nurse came up to him and said, you see that child over there? He's 10 years old, and his parents were killed last night in a bombing. He said, would you mind adopting him and let him live with you in that castle you took over in the hillside? And my father said, yeah, it's fine, let him live with us. And so he said, we took this boy home, and we said we couldn't pronounce his last name because it was some long Italian name. And so we just started calling the kid Willie. And he said Willie would make breakfast for us, and he would make scrambled eggs, and he'd come and stand next to you and talk to you in Italian. He said my men were hardened combat soldiers from Iowa and Omaha and Nebraska, and they would say, oh, piss on you. Well, I don't understand what the hell you're saying. Get the hell out of here. And he said he'd walk in your bedroom at night, and he'd start talking away in Italian after he made your bed. And my father said my men would turn to him and go, oh, piss on you, Willie. I don't know what the hell you're saying. Leave. And so he said about a month later, he said, I'm walking down the street, and he said a big fat Army nurse crossed the street and gets right in my face. And she goes, Major, can I ask you a question about Willie? He's a friend of mine, and he came to me last night, and he wants to know what O Pisagna means. And my father said, I was speechless. He said, I didn't know what the hell to respond to this woman. And she said, if you tell me what O Pisagna is, I'll go back and tell him, and then he will know what you're talking about. And my father said, I was so shocked that he said the woman says, is it something you want for breakfast or something? He goes, yeah, it's a French loaf of bread my men like to eat. And she said, well, I never heard of a French loaf of bread called Pisagna. And he said, I'll tell you what, I'll get you a loaf sometime and see how you like it. And he said, after that, I just tried to avoid that woman and never see her ever again. And about 4 months later, they went down to Barry Harbor, and you'll turn to the next picture. And Barry Harbor was the single most worst night of World War II. There was never a worse night. And my father remembered being at Barry, and he was staying with an Italian family up on a hillside, and he said there was a house down below that had a red light on. And he said, I kept going around trying to find that house with a red light, but Barry was the size of Dayton, Ohio. And he said, we could never find that red light. And Barry was under the command of the British, and he said every night they fogged the city out, and they brought 17 ships over, all laden with resupply for American forces. And one ship, the John Harvey, had mustard gas on it that were going to warehouse in case Hitler decided to gas the American troops. They would have a warehouse full of gas, and they were going to gas him back. And so my father said the day I was at these people's house having dinner, he said the harbor was fogged out. They built a fake city of Barry 10 miles inland out of cardboard and Christmas lights. And he said, I saw those 6 planes come in really fast. And he said they dropped chandelier flares, lit up that harbor. And the next wave of planes came in and they dropped target flares. And he said, oh my God. And the next set of wave of planes came in and dropped the actual bombs. And he said the initial blast from the first ship was so powerful, it blew out people's windows 10 miles inland. And he said, I was literally picked up off my feet and thrown through a glass window. And he said, the only thing that saved my life was it was wintertime and I was wearing a wool officer's coat and all the glass embedded in my coat. And it kept me from being killed. And if he had been killed, I wouldn't be standing here talking to you all. And so after 2,000 people died that night, and I don't think my father in his lifetime ever realized he was mustard gas because the Navy covered that up. And letters that his friends wrote said, we saved the John Harvey and it didn't go up. And that was basically a lie. They didn't save the John Harvey, it did go up. And the sailors that jumped in the water that night, 2,000 people died at Barry, 17 ships went up. This picture was taken 3 days after the bombing.
Wow.
And he said these ships burned like that for like 10 days.
Wow.
And so then he comes home from the war and he's elected the youngest mayor of Dayton. And if you go, that's him as the youngest mayor of Dayton. And they said his hair started to turn prematurely gray after Barry. And people that knew him said he was a funny guy and he used to cut up, but he said after Barry, he never smiled again the rest of his life. And when he became mayor, he decided to broadcast all the council meetings by radio. And he said, he told all the people, there was a bunch of old guys on the city council. He said, if you got anything to say to me, cover the microphone. And he said, we were within a week of broadcasting, and a guy turned to me and said, Mayor, I've got to go take a shit, I'll be right back. And he said, that went all over the city of Dayton. And he said, all these housewives called, and they were furious. And so my father said, again, cover the microphone, don't, say something. And he said, about 2 weeks later, we're talking about a filter system for a pool, and this man said, you know what, when I was a kid, we used to dive in the Erie Canal and come up with horse turds on our head, and we're all still alive and nothing's wrong. So my father said we had to pull the plug, we couldn't do the council meetings anymore. And eventually, they asked my father to run for Congress. So he ended up running for Congress, and they said, why don't you ride the Give 'em Hell special with Truman and give him a few names since you're in the hotel business. So he went to Cincinnati, and the next morning, they said, go in this room, get a donut, some coffee, and the train with Truman will be leaving in about 2 hours. And he said there was an old man in there reading a newspaper. And so he said, I sit next to that old man, and I'm eating a donut. And he said, they tell me the old man's gonna be on the train with us today. And he said, Truman put down the newspaper and said, yeah, I'll be on the train with you today. And he said he was very embarrassed. And they started out in Cincinnati, and Truman gets on the back platform of the train and says, the 80th Congress is the worst Congress in the history of the United States. Put young good friends like my good friend Eddie Green here into Congress. And he said, Eddie and Green and I can work together. I've known Eddie for a long time. And he slapped him on the back. And they go to Middletown, Ohio. Truman says the same thing. They go to Hamilton, Ohio. Truman slaps my father on the back and says, elect Eddie Green to Congress because we're good friends and I can work with Eddie Green. And a reporter walked up to my father and said, is he referring to you as Breen or Green? He said, the next stop's Dayton, Ohio, and if he slaps you on the back, says, my good friend Eddie Green, he said, people in Dayton will know the difference, and the two of you are gonna be a laughing stock. And so the next day, if you turn to the next picture, that's President Truman,
Yeah.
Governor Cox, and that's my father.
Wow.
And Jim Cox is the same person that stayed at the Phillips house, and my father had known him the whole life. The younger generation of the Cox family says that my father didn't really know their grandfather all that well. Well, I hate to dispute it, but they did. And when my father left Congress, he built a home next door to Jim Cox. And he came over to the Cox home when he saw ambulances there in 1957. in July and was there about an hour after the governor passed away. And my father, and so I don't care what the Cox family says that we didn't know them, because he said, well, they're not listed in the book my grandfather wrote, Journey Through My Years, and that's just not a way to judge, I don't think, but if that's how they want to judge it, then fine, whatever. But my father became very good friends with Truman, and Truman liked to talk about the old hotel business. And he'd say, do you remember the Johnson family in Kansas City? My father said, yeah, the guy had a peg leg and he was above the dining room, and you'd be eating in the dining room, you'd hear that thump, thump, thump on the floor. And Truman would get a big kick out of that because they both knew the same people. And the next picture is my father on the U.S. Capitol steps with his secretaries. And the Speaker of the House in that day was Sam Rayburn, and he was a very powerful Speaker of the House. And the doorkeeper was a little man from Mississippi that nobody seemed to have any respect for, and my father adored him. His name was William Fishbait Miller, but nobody ever called him Bill, they called him Fishbait. And there was a representative from Ohio named Wayne Hayes, and my father said, when I shook hands with Wayne Hayes, I just knew I'm going to dislike this man. He said, there was something about him, when I shook his hand, I just knew I wasn't ever going to like this man. And so he said that Wayne Hayes started calling Fishbait early on Mr. Potato Head. He said, you look like Mr. Potato Head, you have those ears sticking out, and you grease your hair back. And when Fishbait eventually wrote a book about his life, he said, I got so tired of that man from Ohio referring to me as Mr. Potato Head for 30 years. And Fishbait was a nice guy, but when the Queen of England came, he had to give a tour of the Capitol. And he said, Queenie, take a look at this picture of George Washington here. And Queenie, you look up here and you can see this. And he said, as soon as she left, he said, I was sent to protocol school. Told, spent 6 months at protocol school. And John Kennedy became my father's desk mate. And the way that worked out was the Meade family from Dayton, Ohio, and my father knew the Meades very well from the hotel business. And they had a summer home in Hyannisport next door to the Kennedys. And they used to sit in the basement, and George Meade Jr. was dating one of the Kennedy sisters and was expected to marry her. And it was always assumed that Joe Kennedy Jr. and George Meade Jr. would be elected to Congress after the war, and they would serve together. But George Meade was killed at the Battle of Guadalcanal, and John Kennedy eventually came. They had gone to Choate Academy together, and they belonged to a club called the Muckers Club that they had created, where they made fun of their professors, and it almost cost them getting kicked out of the school. And so when George Meade was killed as a Marine saving another man's life, and Joe Kennedy Jr. was killed when his plane blew up over the English Channel, Mr. Meade came to my father and said, I'm very good friends with a family that has elected their son to Congress, and so he came to Washington and introduced the two men. And that's how they became very good friends. And my father's girlfriend back in the hotel business was Marion Bergeron. And Marion was the youngest woman ever crowned Miss America. And she dated my father a few times, and then she ended up marrying his best friend, Don Ruhlman. And my father adored Marion and was friends with her the rest of his life. But she was crowned Miss America at age 15 in 1933. She said she won a crown, it was stolen from her the next day. She won a car, but her father was the police chief of the small town in Connecticut, and he wouldn't let her drive the car at 15. So she would come to Washington and bring her Miss America friends, and John Kennedy and my father would go to the Shoreham Hotel and they'd hang out at the bar with her Miss America friends. And somebody said to my mother one time, doesn't that bother you that your husband used to date all these Miss America women? And my mother was 20 years younger, and she said, not really, I was in kindergarten at that time. My father was called into a room one time and told, you're going to run for the Senate because Jack's running for the U.S. Senate. And my father said, they almost demanded that I run for the U.S. Senate because my father was winning his campaigns by 70% or so. And he said, I went home, I laid in bed, And I stared at the ceiling, and he said, when I was in the hotel business, they'd drag some guy over to me and say, this is Congressman so-and-so. And he said, I look down my nose at this person and think, why the hell would you want to be a congressman when you could be a hotel man? And he said, I look at my shiny shoes, my buff nails, and he said, when I laid in bed that night, he said, I realized I had morphed into that human being that I so had so much distaste for. So he walked into Rayburn's office the next day and resigned and walked away. And the next picture is, this is interesting. This is my mother's horse, and my mother was into horses all her life. Horses were the #1 thing to my mother. And this horse was named Lady Mac, and the man holding the horse was the foremost riding instructor in Oakwood by the name of King Tullis, and everybody just called him King. And he had been there since the early 20s teaching the Oakwood kids how to ride horses. And if you notice the vest he wore, it had 6 hand-painted horse buttons on that vest. And he was so proud of those hand-painted horse buttons on the vest. And this picture was taken in September 1939, and it was taken about a week after Hitler had attacked Poland on a national scale. And here's Dayton, Ohio at peace, and Hitler's attacking Poland. And the picture was taken by a staff photographer for the Dayton Daily News, and the picture appeared in the Dayton Daily News the next day. And when my mother was 7 years old, she'd fallen off a horse, and she looked at King, and he said, would you get back on that horse? And my mother was crying, and she said, I don't want to get back on the horse. And he said, you get back on that horse and show that horse that you're the master of the horse. And she looked at King and said, someday when I get married, would you cut the buttons off your vest and give them to me? And so 20 years later, she was walking down the aisle with her father, and he reached out with a blue bag and gave her the buttons off his vest.
Wow.
And she kept those buttons all her life, and then when he died, she put them in the coffin with him.
No.
And my parents eventually had me. My mother was a kind of person that always said, you know, take every opportunity in life and don't turn opportunities down. If somebody invites you to a party, and you may not know half the people at the party, still go to the party and get to know the people, because you never know what that person might be able to offer you. You might become friends with somebody. And he said, don't say, like a lot of people in life, I don't have a car, I can't get to the party. It's too close to Easter. I don't have the right dress. And my mother said, you know, don't be that kind of person, because every time you say no, it narrows your life. Every time you say yes, it widens your life. And my father kind of felt the same way about life. And somebody had told my mother, don't marry that old man. She said, you'll end up being a widow for years and years and years. And the woman that told her that, she was married to a man her age, and that man died very young in marriage, and it ended up being her being the widow, and my mother stayed 35 years married to my father. And when he died, he asked to be buried in a blue terry cloth bathrobe with athletic socks on his feet. His sister came back from the war, and his sister moved to Northeast Harbor, Maine, and lived next to the Rockefellers and the Astors, and became very good friends with these people. And she still kind of ran the show. And when I first married my wife, I don't know if my wife wants me telling this story, but
It's okay.
this will probably be the last story. But my wife, we were in Maine. I said, we're gonna have to go to church tomorrow because we're in Northeast Harbor. And my wife said, I'm not going to church tomorrow. I'm not Catholic. And I'm gonna tell your aunt over dinner that I don't intend to go to church and that I'm not Catholic. And she said, I don't know why everybody in this family is so afraid of her. And I think even President Roosevelt was afraid of Mary Louise. I think most senators and congressmen are afraid of her. And I said, well, you know, she runs the show kind of thing. My wife said, she just took me out to lunch. She bought me a leather purse. We get along. She reminds me of my grandmother, and she won't have any problem with me telling her that I'm not Catholic and I intend to sleep in tomorrow. So halfway through dinner, Mary Louise says, church tomorrow is 9:30 in Northeast Harbor, 10:30 in Bar Harbor. Which one do you intend to go to? And my wife said, I think we'll go to 10:30 in Bar Harbor. She said, oh, that's lovely. She said, that's the one we're going to go to, and we'll all have lunch together. And after we were driving home, I said to my wife, I thought you were going to tell her you weren't Catholic and you didn't intend to go to church tomorrow. She said, well, you heard how she put it. There was no room to negotiate. And I said, well, welcome to the family. And when Mary Louise was dying at a nursing home here in the Dayton area, at 97. I was standing there and she was an hour from death. And a nurse turned to me and said, "Was this woman a real bitch in life?" And I said, "No, she was never a bitch. She was a woman who was a very high caliber woman, and she spoke 5 languages fluently. She'd been a colonel in Army intelligence. She had friends like Peggy Rockefeller and Happy Rockefeller, and she was a very high caliber woman that read every book and anything that was thrown in her face." And I thought, well, that's a hell of a thing to say about her, but you know, that's the perception maybe some people would have thought of her, but she was just a very strong-willed woman, and I think God kept her on earth because I think he was afraid of her. And with Mary Louise, there were always consequences. I mean, even as an 8-year-old, she was walking home from school one day, and Mrs. Barney, who owned the Barney Smith Company, pulled up their chauffeur and told Mary Louise and her girlfriend to get in the car, and she'd drive them home. And Mrs. Barney kept coming by the school every day and picking up Mary Louise and her girlfriend. And Mary Louise said, "I went to Mother and said, Mrs. Barney keeps picking us up, and we want to walk home from school." And her mother said, "Mrs. Barney is a very nice lady, and you just let her take you home from school, and she means well, and she's one of my dearest friends." And so Mary Louise said, "I just took a bag of peanuts to school the next day, and my girlfriend and I ate a bag of peanuts and wiped some greasy hands on her car seats, and 2 days of that, she quit picking us up." And so that's the end of my stories. Anybody have any questions? Yes?
What years was your father mayor?
He was mayor in 1945 to 1948 when he resigned to run for U.S. Congress. Any other questions? Yes?
What's your favorite story, Mr. Breen?
My favorite story, if I had any, would be the horse story where my mother asked for the buttons. It's just a nice, innocent story. And I like that story of a child asking for a button. And any other questions? Yes?
Did your father ever write letters home from the war?
He did, and we have all those letters. And Mary Louise, because she was in Army intelligence, she wrote to the family when they landed in North Africa. And everything was supposed to be coded. And she said, "I'm laying in bed here at the embassy, and I'm reading Eddie's favorite book. And his favorite book was Beau Geste." And so the family knew he was in North Africa. And it had other coded things that when the family would pick up on it, said, "Well, we know where he is." Any other questions? Well, I want to thank all of you for coming. This is the last time I'm going to talk publicly of these stories, and I'm not going to do this again. There was a man that wanted to make a movie about these stories, and it was, for the last 4 years, something he talked about, but after 4 years, he's gone nowhere with it. So I'm going to kind of drop that idea as well. And if anybody knows somebody with deep pockets that wants to take on a movie project, I'll be open to the idea for another month or so. But after that, I'm 66 years old, and it's just time to call it a day. So, but I thank you all very much for coming.